The Book of Boba Fett opens with the promise of reclamation, a legend returning to seize control of his own narrative. But almost immediately the story begins drifting away from him, not through subversion or mystery, but through a consistent pattern of narrative displacement where the world acts and Boba responds. From the earliest episodes, Boba is positioned less as an instigator and more as a recipient of events. Assassination attempts find him, political tensions confront him, betrayals surface around him, yet rarely does he initiate a decisive move that forces the story to reorient itself. This distinction is subtle, but fatal for a protagonist, because drama is not generated by presence alone, it is generated by choice, and the show repeatedly frames Boba as someone enduring circumstances rather than shaping them. When danger appears, Boba survives it. When conflict emerges, he manages it. When threats escalate, he waits them out. But survival and patience are not the same as propulsion, and the story feels it. Even moments that should belong entirely to him, such as claiming Jabba's throne, are treated as endpoints rather than beginnings, accomplishments rather than levers that alter the board. Instead of seeing how Boba's decisions ripple outward, we watch him absorb pressure, recover, and remain fundamentally unchanged in position, which causes the narrative to flatten rather than accelerate. This issue is compounded by the heavy reliance on flashbacks, which, while emotionally resonant, function as a substitute for present-day agency rather than a foundation for it. The Tusken sequences are intimate, grounded, and thoughtfully constructed. They give Boba pain, humility, and perspective, but they also siphon narrative energy away from the timeline where he is supposed to be ruling. Each return to the past deepens who Boba was, but delays who he is becoming, creating a strange imbalance where the most meaningful growth happens off the board, while the current conflict idles. The result is a protagonist who feels psychologically rich in memory, but strategically inert in the present, a man whose most active transformation is already behind him. While the galaxy of Tatooine reorganizes itself around new power vacuums, Boba remains curiously static, seated on the throne, reacting to information rather than generating it. This stagnation becomes more pronounced through contrast because other characters are allowed to think, plan, and execute in ways Boba rarely does. Fennec Shand, in particular, emerges as the operational center of the story, handling intelligence, anticipating threats, orchestrating responses, and making tactical decisions that actually move events forward. She gathers information, she suggests strategies, she executes decisive actions, while Boba often listens, agrees, and follows through, positioning him as a figurehead beside his own lieutenant. This dynamic is not inherently flawed, but it becomes damaging when the supposed lead feels secondary in competence and initiative, especially in a story explicitly about claiming power. Power without direction becomes ceremonial, and Boba's authority often feels symbolic rather than functional, reinforced by how frequently conflicts resolve without his direct involvement. Negotiations conclude off-screen, alliances solidify through intermediaries, betrayals unfold independently, and by the time Boba arrives, the situation has often already crystallized. When action finally erupts, he is present, capable, and visually imposing. But presence is not authorship, and spectacle cannot compensate for narrative absence. These moments highlight a deeper issue. The story is structured in a way that does not require Boba to be the engine, only the face, which undercuts the premise at its foundation. This problem is exacerbated by the vagueness of Boba's stated goal. Ruling with respect is an ethos, not a strategy. An ethos alone cannot drive plot mechanics. Other factions want profit, territory, revenge, or survival. These are concrete motivations that naturally generate conflict and escalation, while Boba's desire remains abstract and undefined. Because his endgame is unclear, his actions feel disconnected from long-term consequence. Decisions do not stack toward a visible objective. They simply maintain equilibrium. Without a clear plan, the audience cannot track progress or failure, making Boba's journey feel static, even as events swirl around him. The story constantly gestures toward transformation, without allowing it to occur in real time, leaving Boba suspended between who he was and who he might become. This creates the sensation that the narrative is moving laterally rather than forward, expanding outward to include other characters, factions, and timelines, while drifting away from its supposed centre. By the midpoint, the question quietly shifts from what Boba will do next to what will happen around Boba, a subtle reframing that signals loss of protagonism. And once that shift occurs, it becomes increasingly difficult to reclaim narrative gravity, because the story has trained itself to operate without his initiative. This is not a failure of performance or iconography, but of structural emphasis. The show repeatedly chooses to develop the world at Boba's expense, rather than through him. The result is a series that feels busy, but unfocused, rich in texture, but poor in momentum, anchored by a character who is present in every episode, but rarely central to its movement. From here, the analysis can move into how this displacement accelerates once other legacy characters enter the frame, and how the series gradually becomes about everything orbiting Boba rather than Boba himself. Once the narrative begins to drift away from Boba Fett, it does not correct course. It accelerates because the show increasingly finds momentum everywhere, except within its title character, transforming what should be a character study into an anthology orbiting a static centre. The most visible turning point arrives with the introduction of Din Djarin, and the effect is immediate and unmistakable. The pacing sharpens, the objectives clarify, and the emotional through-line tightens in ways the series had previously struggled to achieve. These episodes are not merely cameos, they are fully realised narrative engines, complete with clear motivations, obstacles, and consequences, and in their presence, the contrast becomes impossible to ignore. Din arrives with a problem, pursues a solution, fails, adapts, and changes, all within a compact arc, reminding the audience what forward motion feels like in Star Wars television. Grogu's emotional gravity, Luke's mythic reappearance, and Din's evolving code of honour reintroduce stakes rooted in choice and consequence, pulling attention away from Boba, not because they are louder, but because they are active. The series does not gradually rebalance after this shift, it leans into it, allowing entire episodes to function without Boba at all, an unthinkable move if he were truly the story's engine. When the audience realises they do not miss him during these chapters, the structural problem becomes undeniable. The narrative has proven it can function, and even thrive without its supposed protagonist. This is not merely a marketing misstep, it is a storytelling admission that the show is more confident when telling other people's stories than Boba's. Part of this stems from a reliance on iconography in place of development. Boba Fett looks correct, sounds correct, and occupies space with the visual authority fans expect, but these elements are treated as substitutes for internal conflict rather than expressions of it. The series assumes familiarity as depth, leaning on the audience's pre-existing relationship with the character instead of actively building a new one, resulting in a portrayal that feels preserved rather than explored. We are shown what Boba stands for visually, but rarely what it costs him to stand for it. And without cost, character becomes posture. This leads directly into the problem of moral stasis. Boba is presented as good from the outset, not struggling toward goodness, not testing it under pressure, but simply embodying it as a fixed state. He does not wrestle with cruelty learned in his past. He does not meaningfully question mercy. And he does not face dilemmas where his values are genuinely at risk, removing the friction that creates drama. Static morality flattens protagonism, because growth requires error, and Boba is rarely allowed to fail in ways that change him. When he makes mistakes, the story cushions them, redirecting consequences onto side characters or external forces, preserving Boba's image at the expense of his arc. This treatment positions him as a moral constant, rather than a developing character, more symbol than person, which further distances the audience from his internal journey. Without internal struggle, the narrative leans heavily on external threats to generate momentum, but here too the series falters, because its antagonists are thinly sketched and inconsistently motivated. Weak villains create a vacuum. Without a strong opposing force, conflict cannot escalate organically, forcing the show to rely on spectacle, nostalgia, and reinforcements to maintain interest. A compelling antagonist defines the boundaries of a protagonist's growth, and without one, Boba has nothing substantial to push against, no pressure capable of reshaping him. Instead of sharpening Boba through opposition, the story disperses conflict across minor players, spreading tension thin and diffusing its impact. As a result, Boba remains reactive, responding to threats that never feel personal enough to challenge his worldview or strategic approach. This structural softness culminates in the finale, which unintentionally exposes the show's core issue. The climax functions because of accumulation rather than transformation. Allies arrive, reinforcements appear, familiar faces contribute, and spectacle carries the sequence forward. But Boba's presence is not the linchpin holding it together. If Boba were removed or replaced, the structure of the finale would largely remain intact. The machinery of resolution does not depend on his specific choices. This is the clearest indicator that he was not the narrative center, because a true protagonist is irreplaceable, their decisions uniquely necessary for the outcome. Instead, Boba feels optional, an icon inserted into a framework that does not require his agency to function. The tragedy of this outcome is that the pieces for a compelling arc were present: a survivor redefining power, a killer seeking community, a legend confronting obsolescence, but the show rarely commits to any of them fully. By splitting focus, deferring agency, and prioritizing preservation over transformation, the series undermines its own premise. The Book of Boba Fett does not fail because it misunderstands who Boba was. It falters because it never fully decides who he needs to become. In trying to protect the character, it freezes him, and in freezing him, it lets the story move on without him. What remains is a series rich in atmosphere and connective tissue, but hollow at its center, a narrative where the galaxy evolves and the protagonist stands still. That imbalance is why the show feels simultaneously full and empty, busy with motion, yet lacking direction, anchored by a figure who should have been its driving force. Ultimately, the series answers a question it never intended to ask. What happens when a story is built around an icon instead of a character? The answer is displacement, drift, and a finale that works despite its title, rather than because of it. With that, this analysis reaches its conclusion, closing the arc on why the Book of Boba Fett struggled to center its own protagonist, not through incompetence, but through structural hesitation.
Thank you for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that share button. My main channel is Critical Analysis Hub, where I post Star Wars content about the movies. My secondary channel is Critical Analysis Hub Plus, where I focus on the shows of Star Wars. And my third channel is Critical Analysis Hub XP, where I post comic books. Be sure to take a moment and check them out. Thanks, and may the Force be with you.